I am unmuted. Somebody send me a chat to tell me if you can hear me.
You're good, Les.
Okay, so I am going to load my slides. And then can everyone see the slides? Chris, can you see the slides?
They're there.
Good enough. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. And thank you for all of those who took some time out of their evening to come tonight. What we are going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach to this. I'm not going to kind of regale you with the whole process of coming to the book and whatnot. You can ask me that after if you wish. What I'm going to do is set the stage for what I'm going to say tonight by giving you, in broad terms, the reason for the book. And then the lecture itself tonight is going to really talk about a further intent, I guess I would say, of the book. In other words, ostensibly the book was to talk about a department at the University of Toronto, which was called the Department of Hospital Administration, which was founded in 1947. The book immediately, when we talk about that, puts it into a larger context, because really, you can't talk about this department without speaking about something else, which is called the School of Hygiene at the University of Toronto, which, though called a School of Hygiene, and really, of course, many of you will know hygiene is a British term for public health, so it's really a School of Public Health. You couldn't talk about the department I was writing about without knowing the school, and as I say, it had the status of a faculty that it was nested within. And so the department was formed for two major reasons. One of them was the Kellogg Foundation actually approached the head of the School of Hygiene, Robert DeFries at the time, and said, we want to fund a few schools, 2 or 3 in the United States, and we want to fund one in Canada in hospital administration. Throughout the interwar period, but especially during World War II, hospitals were really coming into their own as centers of care and centers of diagnosis. And so they were proliferating in number and they were getting bigger. A huge concern started in the 30s, continued in the 40s, as to how should these places be managed, because there really was no, if you will, professional management to a hospital, and it was felt there needed to be. They were very, very complex organizations, and there needed to be a dedicated manager, but a manager schooled in that area type thing. Kellogg had a bias, I think a very good one, that they were only going to fund a hospital administration school that was nested in a school of public health. They were not going to fund one that was nested in a business school, if you will. That wasn't what they believed should be. So anyway, they approached Robert DeFries, and he seized upon the idea, went to talk to the president of the university, who was also for it, and away it went. And the department took in its first students in September 1947. Almost immediately, this department went national. It primarily, the School of Hygiene itself was one of the top schools of public health in the world. And so by virtue of that, if you will, Robert DeFries very intelligently, if you will, picked probably the most knowledgeable person in Canada to head up this department, a guy named Dr. Harvey Agnew. He had national connections right across the country. And so immediately this program assumed a national stature. And so maybe I won't say too much more than that. And then it just kind of kept on growing. So having said that, giving you that little bit of a base, let's start moving into what all took place. So this is the 2017 annual report for what is called IHPME, the Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation. And what they did in 2017, because it was the 70th anniversary, they asked if I could share with them a draft of the book, which I did. And they took pieces of the draft, and they're in that annual report if anybody were to be interested. Okay, this is a picture that is in the book. The picture in the book is actually one of the proofs that was being used at the time. This is the final that you see, and this picture appears in the annual report, and it takes a quote from the book. The individual in the picture is Dr. J.G. Fitzgerald, who was for many years until beginning in the 1920s and ending in 1940, was the head of the School of Hygiene. He was also the head of Connaught Laboratories. An incredible individual, I would say a genius in his own right. He started two world-class institutions, the school and the labs. The school actually got started because Rockefeller Foundation approached him, and also the university president in the early 1920s, and said, we think public health is going to be a big deal. We want to fund 3 schools of public health. One is going to be in Canada, 2 are going to be in the United States. The 2 in the United States are going to be Harvard and Hopkins, and we would like you to be the one in Canada. So that speaks to the stature that Fitzgerald already had in the 1920s. Long story short, the university got the funding. It would have been a lot of funding today. It was probably almost approach $100 million or so. Gave them money to build a building, and also fund the operations for, I believe it was 7 years. So an incredible individual, really put Canada on the map in terms of public health. He was a member of something called the Dominion Council of Health, which was the deputy ministers of each of the provincial departments of health, along with the federal deputy minister, and he was the only other sitting person on that. And again, speaks to his stature. Okay, just because of where I am right now, which of course is at Trinity, that a book in gestation, of course, becomes a significant part of your life. And my life at that time was teaching at Dalla, Lana, and at Trinity. And so the book began to generate a number of connections with Trinity. There were also kind of indirect connections. The direct connection Sylvia's kind of alluded to. I'll get into it a little bit further in the lecture. There was a professor here at Trinity, Professor Gruba, who was quite involved in the Saskatchewan doctor strike, and a graduate of this program mentioned in the book was the deputy minister during that time. There are also some indirect Trinity connections. Kind of interestingly, I could be correcting a Trinity essay, have nothing to do with the book, and yet a book idea would pop into my head. I used to take a mid-morning tea many days with Brian Parker. We would talk about the book, but we talk about many things. Brian's written a number of books. I had many senior common room conversations with Don Rickard. It's quite interesting with Don. I first met Don, I don't want to say how many years ago, it'll date us both. When I was an executive at TGH, we hadn't yet begun to merge with other hospitals. He was president of the Donner Canadian Foundation, and I had written a grant to the Donner Canadian Foundation to launch a project in telemedicine, which he funded. The ministry matched his funding, and away we went. Then another connection is many Wednesdays from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. I'd work on the book in the Trinity Chapel when that choir was practicing. I just love that choir. Okay, there are non-Trinity connections. One is a lot of conversations with Dean Stenny Brown at Dalla Lana. Many of you will have heard him on the radio many times during COVID. Lots of conversations with Greg Marshalldoe and Sarah Allen at IHPME. They're both experts in comparative health systems. Both very, very involved with something called the NAO, North American Observatory. I'll get into that a little bit later. and lots of conversations and lots of time spent at the U of T archives, and a fellow named Thijs Klempenhauer, who at the time was one of the archivists, and now I'm very pleased and proud to know that at a very young age, he's the university archivist. All of this points to a central reason for the book, and part of the reason we're speaking tonight is that it's about it's about a specific, I guess you would say, node of excellence. But from that, I go to the fact that in Canada, we have had these nodes of excellence, many different areas, not all in health, many not in health, but they've rarely coalesced, and when they have, they've never held. In other words, we've never really, in my opinion, had a critical mass of excellence. I would say Canada in World War II, for example, had this. We were the rate at which we were producing war material, the number of crown corporations that had been formed to do that, the number of discoveries and patents that were being generated in many areas. Canada was punching way above its level. And so we're not just talking excellence, in my opinion, we're talking like real excellence, world-class stuff. This is what we had, I think, with the School of Hygiene, with the department. And I'm not sure we're quite there yet with Dalla, Lana, and I say this not at all to speak pejoratively about Dalla, Lana, because it's a great institution. It's just a very young institution. But I mean, many of you will know Dalla, Lana in 2017, I think, was rated, if I'm remembering right, number 5 in the world. So they're rolling. It varies. We've been number 5, number 7, number 8. If I had a wish for Dalla, Lana, I'd like it to be what the School of Hygiene was, which is one of the top 3, which I think this is imminently achievable. The other aspect of Trinity that's very important, and it links to a dream of mine, Trinity housed, in my opinion, a world-class policy institute. I noted in the book, it was called the Canadian Institute of International Affairs. John Holmes here at Trinity was its executive director for many years. Marion McGee was his assistant. She was also associate editor of something called the International Journal. And actually, a colleague of mine at Dalla, Lana, Mark Dobrow, and he's also at IHBME, we came to talk to Marion, and I've done this a few times with Marion, and I think each time I do, she shakes her head, because I say, Marion, I would like that we start a policy institute in health, and there's some aspects of the CIIA that I would like as a template. And I think she always, well, what's foreign relations got to do with healthcare? But the Trinity CIIA was really, really good, in my opinion. And a mistake the Canadian government made is when they folded it into something else. Now, I say this because a policy institute is a type of capacity this country needs. I would argue we need, again, a foreign relations policy institute that is on par with the CIIA. Some of you will know that this was spun out of something called the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. A number of the major Commonwealth countries, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, formed their own IIA, if you will, AIIA, SIIA, South Africa. Now, all of them were very good, but Canada's was particularly good, in my opinion. And this type of capacity, this type of research and directed research that is independent, that has close and strong ties to academia, this is something we need. It's not just something we need, it's something that's needed. England, for example, I mean, the Royal Institute, also popularly known as Chatham House, which actually was bought for them by a Canadian, is one of the preeminent policy institutes in the world, without question. We need that in Canada. But we also need a health policy institute. England has 2 of them, 2 really, really large ones. King's Fund is one, and the Health Foundation is another. We need something like that. And like I say, it's a dream of mine. We'll see if I manage to bring it to fruition someday. So reason for the book, in short, was to acquaint us with an important aspect of our history. The Globe and Mail kind of got at something we lack, in that in Canada, generally, we're unaware of our history, and when we do, most often we do not know it, and when we do not celebrate it. This Globe and Mail editorial that was last September pointed out, it's not that nothing of consequence happens here. Plenty has, and much of it is very unique and very highly instructive. But while our past is rich, our sense of history, which abounds in nuance, contradictions, compromises, and indeed triumphs, is not. And I think that's, you know, we almost look south and think, oh, that's quite an interesting history, and ours is kind of undramatic and boring. Well, no, it's anything but, in my opinion. So we need to know more about our history, specifically this type of history. We've had a number of instances where we've punched at a world-class level, but we're largely unaware of that. We need to become aware of it, we need to aspire to it, and we need to keep the momentum going. And if I'm going to sort of be fairly blunt, and you guys can disagree with me when we get to the question period, but I've got an issue with my country. I think we do not aspire enough. And to a degree, we sit on our thumbs, I think, to a degree. In healthcare, Greg Marshall will know this, because I believe he was at this conference in Regina where they brought a Princeton academic, Huey Reinhardt, and David Naylor wrote about this in the Toronto Star some while ago. And what Huey said to the group at that meeting is, he said, you people, Huey actually happened to be an undergrad at the University of Saskatchewan. He's a German refugee, and was there taking an economics undergraduate degree, went to Princeton on a scholarship and never left. Consulted throughout the world, very well known. But what Huey said to the people at that conference was, he said, people, you've been gifted with one of the best models in the world. And, you know, it's us that grew this. But he said, I fear that you've been sitting on your hands and the world is passing you by. And I think Huey was bang on. We really haven't done anything with Medicare since we put it into operation in July 1st, 1968. And I think that is an issue. Other countries have. What Huey could have told us as well at the time, he couldn't have told us that at the time because of the conferences wasn't happening, but Huey also consulted, as did Greg Marshall, to the Taiwanese government, who adopted our model for their national health insurance system. Taiwan covers far more than we do at far less cost with better quality. We've got things to learn. Okay, my book is an instance of world class, the subject, not the book. It deals with this U of T department that I mentioned to you. It began as the Department of Hospital Administration, later became the Department of Health Administration, and then became what's called the Institute of Health Policy Management Evaluation. Its predecessors, if you will, were very much world class, and I mentioned Connaught Labs, also world class. IHPME name change is for a reason. When the department was founded, it was really a professional program, and that was its exclusive focus. Now it would be the opposite. The professional degree is a smaller part of what's going on at IHPME, and health systems research in many different sub areas would be the larger part. And if you will, I think this is exactly the way it should be. It should be research that's energizing and guiding a lot of what is being taught to tomorrow's professionals. So why all this about world class? It connotes excellence. You're punching at the level of a numbered few in the world. It's its own species. What it takes to get there, to remain there, is a world away from the norm. And that is this book. We're going to talk a little bit about Trinity in this as well later. So I wanted to shed some light on this. I wanted you to know just how good these institutions really were, and really because I want them back. And again, I got to be careful. I mean, I don't want to say they're not there. IHPME is excellent at what it does, without question. I think it's far better. I don't know, how do I want to say this? Canadians always hide their light under a bushel. IHPME is up there with the best of the best, in my opinion, as is Dalla, Lana. I would, like I say, like them each to be among the top three. They are close, close, but I want them there. And this whole Geist, if you will, it's a type of culture I want, a verve, an esprit. Like I say, we have pockets. I want it more generally. I want Canada to up its game. This book shows us it's possible. Why? Because we've been there, and we've been there not only in health. I won't go into some of the other, the other areas. I've mentioned to you World War II. Again, we can talk about that after if you wish. Now, there's a couple of unique aspects about the book. And it's basically because of two ideas I have about history. And history itself needs to be something that, if you will, you cannot ignore when you do policy. You got to know where you've been to know where you're going to go. It's just a fundament. Places like France, places like Britain, they write histories of their government departments. Some of them get published and into the common wheel. Most do not. But the reason they do this is because they know how absolutely vital history is to their own memory, in terms of these departments, that they need to have this memory. So history itself is important. I mean, Nobel laureate Douglas North, it talks about something called path dependence. You get into paths, whether you can move out or not. A lot of it is dependent upon your knowledge of how you got there. Now, more specifically, in terms of what I was then wanting to do with history, is I'm a huge believer that you need to locate your history within a larger context. An event, in my case, a department, does not exist in isolation. It cannot be properly understood only in and of itself. So you need to be also looking at that context. And if in terms of the book, I kind of start with almost the world, if you will, move down into the School of Hygiene and then into the department itself. Another big aspect of this is I think you need to look at history, whether it's the history of a nation or in this case, the history of a department, you need to look at it comparatively. So for example, when we talk COVID, which is on everybody's minds these days, I think we don't just talk Canada and COVID, we talk about Canada relative to the rest of the world. And I'll say a little more of that later. You look at only yourself, you probably think you're not too bad. Or right now we look across the border and we say, oh my gosh, we really are pretty good. Well, we're not among the best. We're nowhere close. And we should be. We've got 12,000 deaths and counting in this country, 12,000 loved ones that are no longer with us, and each of those matter. South Korea, as an example, is around 500 deaths, a country with a population of over 50 million people, and I mean, it's not to be believed in terms of how far below. But the reason they're there is because they have a set of systems that make us look like kindergarten. And again, do we aspire to that or not? And I would argue we need to. Let's then get into that just a little bit more. So we begin to take this history and locate it within successively larger layers of history. These concern both time and place. In terms of place, it's the history of the faculty, so the School of Hygiene, the history of what was going around it, municipally, provincially, nationally. IHPME was moving in lockstep with that. And so was the School of Hygiene. There was a time, I'm trying to remember when it was, I believe it was the 50s, that kind of doesn't matter, where of the Dominion Council of Health, 2/3 to 3/4, depending on the year, of these deputy ministers were graduates of the U of T School of Hygiene. That's the type of people it was graduating. Similarly, in that time, if you would look at the CEOs of all the major Canadian hospitals, you were going to find a very high proportion of them that came out of this department of hospital administration. Tommy Douglas, for example, when Tommy Douglas became premier, he knew that he had a department that no way could do what he wanted to be done. And of course, what Tommy Douglas was heading was to build a number of hospitals in Saskatchewan amongst the lowest beds per capita in the nation. And he also wanted to start a health insurance program. He knew that he needed a department that, again, was a world away of the one he had. What did he start to do almost immediately? Hire graduates of this program in both public health and health administration. Time, there were two important elements, and these concern with what was going on around it. I've alluded to each of these. Hospitals were emerging as a centerpiece of healthcare. The public's attention was focused on them. They were the preeminent institution in many communities in Canada. Canada as well, the United States was another one, had embarked on unprecedented construction activity. Our major hospitals, TGH, Sick Kids, Mount Sinai, for example, had all plans. They had put them on hold during World War II. They were dusting off these plans. They were starting to embark upon major building schemes. Sick Kids at the time was on College Street, College and Elizabeth. They had bought a piece of property on University Avenue. They relocated. Mount Sinai was the same. Universal healthcare had emerged as a potent new force in society. And of course, Tommy Douglas was all over that. I get at this in the book. I believe that universal healthcare, many times called UHC, is one of the most magnificent accomplishments of the 20th century. It's also emerging as a powerful force in the 21st century. Why? Is because it's no longer seen as only a program for richer developed nations. There's a number of nations that are in the development phase that have picked targeted areas that they will provide universal health coverage for, and they've made incredible differences. Most will pick women and babies, and you know, they will start driving down very quickly maternal and natal mortality rates. I also think it's a powerful symbol of human solidarity. We're going to get into this in just a little bit. It's a right of citizenship where people stand equal to each other. And as an example, I mean, health insurance covers everybody, the rich and the poor, and again, people stand equal. So as I say, the department was mirroring these developments, and the pandemic is refocusing attention on that. And on the other side of the coin, public health. We are finding we need good hospital capacity, we need good ICU capacity, and we definitely need a really good public health function, I guess I'll say. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. So 7 things in terms of the book. I wanted to show the bedrock of IHPME. Again, I'm repeating myself. It's deep roots in the School of Hygiene, the Connaught Labs, and the influence of Jerry Fitzgerald. None of this would likely have happened without Fitzgerald. It would, like I say, an incredible individual. I wanted to show how immediately it hit the ground running. Pretty much, it was at the Center of Health Administration in Canada. I've mentioned Harvey Agnew. And actually, a little known fact about this is that in its early years, it had far more US applications than Canadian. The Americans knew how good it was. The issue was, of course, it was a Canadian school for hospital administration and needed to take a majority of Canadians. What I also wanted to show is the leadership of the program, its faculty, its grads, their ongoing involvement in the program. People like Jim McNabb, who's shown there, Jerry Turner, for many years, the CEO of Mount Sinai, Gary Chatfield, an assistant deputy minister in Ontario, a deputy minister in Alberta. Jim McNabb and Gary Chatfield I worked for. Relevant to today, the Toronto Medical Officers of Health, Sheila Basur, who was here during SARS, and Eileen DeVille now, both are graduates of the same program I was in. I wanted to show how this leadership continues. Another grad, and actually at one point was the chair of the department, Vivek Goel, who I've known for years and interviewed a number of times for this book, has recently been appointed president of the University of Waterloo. He's an expert in public health. He was the founding head of Public Health Ontario. And during the pandemic, he's created a series of podcasts, which you can find on the U of T website, dealing with different aspects. His leadership began when he was a grad student, and he opposed the demise of the School of Hygiene. Again, don't really have time to get into this in a huge way. But the School of Hygiene caused a lot of controversy within the University of Toronto. And to the U of T's credit, they must have revisited that with various committees, if you will, university-wide committees, I don't know, 3 or 4 anyway. And then eventually made the decision, nope, we got to be back here. To show that I wanted to show the character of the program, it had a certain esprit de corps, it was expected to lead. And I also in the book wanted to identify some new ideas that might serve as a springboard for further discussion. For example, something I call the University Avenue Medical Cluster, which is really the health sciences building at McCall and College, the Faculty of Medicine on Queen's Park Crescent, the Faculty of Pharmacy there, the School of Nursing. You're getting this cluster of academic faculties, basically at the corner of college and university. The university itself then, on the other side, is, many of you know, the Banting and Best Center is undergoing a major redevelopment. Across the street, you've got land that was ceded by TGH, the college wing, where I had my first office at TGH. That land, the full block of college wing, was given over to Mars, and you've now got a major research park there. So you've got 3 essential ingredients: academic faculties, a research park, and major academic health sciences centers, all clustered within, I don't know, a 3 or 4 block radius. And, you know, are we getting to something here? Question mark. So I wanted to show things like that. I wanted to speak about how important impact is in terms of what we do now at the Academy. It's no longer just a question of writing grants and publishing papers. We want to be making a difference. The university needs to reach out. It needs to push its research out. And so I wanted to have some of those discussions. I also wanted to show how integral hospitals and healthcare, Medicare in this country, are to our society. And just briefly on that, they're really, you know, you don't have possibilities without health. We're learning this in COVID. I mean, if we don't have a healthy population, we don't have an economy that's functional. So really, really important to have good health. So let's push this out a little bit. These forces are not only important in and of themselves, as I say, in terms of a fundament for your country. They're also important in terms of the hold they have on the public imagination. And I wanted to get at this and do in the beginning of the book. Countries with the universal health insurance, they all have strong feelings about it. I'm gonna show you the NHS, which is probably amongst the strongest. But you could go to France. I remember Greg Marshall-Doe had brought an academic over from Italy. She mentioned to me afterwards, the Italians feel equally strongly. It's generalizable, if you will. I'm going to show you what Canadians think about Medicare. Hospitals, the same thing. The next few slides I'm going to show you are going to illustrate that. And so I wanted to demonstrate the power behind this. And so what we're going to get into now is the NHS, which is the British equivalent of Medicare, as part of its opening ceremony at the London 2012 Olympics, talked about the NHS. It featured it. And these next few slides, like I say here, I wish I could have used them in the book, because what you've got is all the pomp and ceremony, you know, pageantry, if you will, of an opening ceremony. It's choreographed by an Academy Award director, Danny Boyle. It's featuring, like I say, their equivalent of our Medicare, and also featuring their equivalent of Sick Kids, GOSH, which stands for Great Ormond Street Hospital. And so, you know, imagine the drama. The whole world is watching. The Queen is there. You know, the cabinet of the British Parliament is there. Many other heads of state there. This will start to give you a bit of a sense. So these are actual slides from that evening. So, you know, the Thames River. This then is the Olympic Stadium. And this is when they went to the NHS segment. And of course, they're playing, of course, to the camera, shooting over the stadium as much as they are to the people in the room. It's all about tomorrow. Interestingly, the beds used in this opening ceremony were special. They had luminous mattresses that were then used to spell out NHS and GOSH, what you've seen in the slide. You'll see GOSH in a moment. These LEDs were taken out of the mattresses and they were then donated to Tunisian hospitals. So there's GOSH. It also did other things. J.K. Rowling, the iconic Harry Potter author, was reading from the equally iconic Peter Pan, a story long associated with GOSH. Barry, the author of Peter Pan, donated the royalties, all the royalties to Peter Pan, to GOSH. As a matter of fact, it's only been done at once in British history. When that patent ran out in the 1980s, the British House of Lords renewed it in perpetuity. As long as GOSH exists, they get the royalties. Another indicator, Thomas Piketty in his international bestseller mentioned this as well, the opening ceremony of the London Olympics and on the NHS. So these slides begin to get at a wider intent. As I say, countries feel strongly, the British rank the NHS as the most cherished institution, higher than the royal family, higher than the British Navy. We do too, better than hockey, the Canadian flag, or the RCMP. And there's some of the different levels of how our healthcare system right on top. So I wanted to get at the power behind this. Why? Is because this university and this college are important parts of this fabric. Canada values its public institutions. That's precisely what this university and this college are. We have a deep history of public institutions. Linda McQuaig has a book on this, former Globe and Mail journalist. We need to have knowledge of this as a country, and we need to have the confidence to take it further. In this neoliberal era, many times public institutions, you know, no, it's all got to be private. Not. This is more than you want to know, but I mean, a Harvard philosopher who actually studied under Charles Taylor, Canadian philosopher, and Michael J. Sandel, and a Stanford economist both say there are areas that should never be in the marketplace. Health is one, education is another. They've both written separate books on that. I wanted to convey that given the iconic nature, this puts a great responsibility on places like Dalla, Lana, or an IHPME. They're vouchsafing this public trust. I would argue it's the same with Trinity. You know, the number of leaders that have came out of Trinity, ministers, you want to name it, Trinity has this responsibility as well. So there's another part of these institutions in terms of hospitals and Medicare. They're looked upon as anchor institutions. They anchor your country. Like I say, they're fundaments, they're necessary. They also are models. They pay livable wages, have good staff development, have good benefits, that type of thing. They have a social as well as a healthcare mission, if you will. I also wanted to correct omissions in the literature. There's almost nothing written about Burns Roth. He had an incredible career. Started out in the North. He was a medical officer of health and also a hospital administrator in Whitehorse, Yukon. He came from there into this program, but he didn't graduate. He was already an MD, and he didn't graduate because he kind of caught the bug in terms of Tommy Douglas. An earlier graduate named Ed Wan was all over him to come to Saskatchewan, and you need to come now, that type of thing. And that's precisely what he did. And he was 6 months away from his degree, and he said, nope, January, I gotta go work for Tommy Douglas. He interviewed in December, spoke with Douglas personally, and I guess that's it, he got the bug. And so he quit his program, went into the Douglas Department of Public Health, as it was called, and never looked back. Became its deputy minister in the early 50s, was there until 1962, came here to be the director of the program in 1962, and retired 10 years later. Another omission I wanted to correct was Jim McNabb. In a recent book on Toronto General, there's nothing about Jim McNabb. He was there for over 10 years, led TGH through a number of very notable achievements, and for some reason there was nothing in him in this book. Published, well, I won't say it was published by. And I also wanted to add a different perspective on Fitzgerald's suicide. Fitzgerald shocked everybody in 1940, and I take a little bit of a different view of what took place. Just very briefly, although I should, I should not say this, you should buy the book. No, just kidding. I think, most people talk about Fitzgerald's suicide as mental illness, and okay. But I think what gets omitted is the type of pressure that is on an individual like Fitzgerald. Pressure in a number of ways. You're a celebrity, and that's tough to deal with. That constant attention. But there's so much expected of you. Fitzgerald was running 2 large organizations, was also had research of his own, constantly looking for new discoveries. One of the most beautiful things about Fitzgerald is when he founded Connaught Labs, as important in Connaught Labs as application of discovery, it was, a pharmaceutical manufacturing facility, he was driving the prices down. He was exhorting his people to find cheaper ways of doing this because he wanted everything that Connaught did to be available for as cheaply as possible. He he was part of the development of the insulin patent, and this is probably the only patent that was taken out not to get a monopoly on a discovery, but for the precise opposite reason, to make it as widely available as possible. They didn't want to patent insulin at first. And they got advice. They said, look, you guys, to do what you want to do, you have no choice. You must patent it. And so one of the codicils in the patent was they would license to anybody, but they had to produce insulin and sell it at cost. And so there's a good part of the world that didn't like that. They wanted to make profits, and they wanted to make nice profits on insulin. And so, fascinating individual. He funded Banting and Best's research. They had other funding as well, but he was one of the people that was backing them big time. Yeah, you might think this a bit silly. I wanted to work Trinity into the book, and I did. The power of printers proofs. There are 28 instances, mentions of Trinity in the book. And the reason, again, is there needs to be institutions for the best of the best. Trinity is one of these, so is the U of T, so was the School of Hygiene, the Department of Hospital Administration, so is IHPME and the Dalla Lana. There need to be these types of institutions, quite unabashedly. I also wanted to get at how health systems are a bulwark against many different things that can happen in the world, many different types of threats, perhaps even existential, in other words, civilizational demise threats. We get at this a little bit. There's a quote I found in 2018 that I thought I just have to put this in the book, and I can't take credit for it. It wasn't my thought. And it was an author that wrote about Bellevue, which is the TGH, if you will, of New York City. And at the time he was writing, Ebola was a bit of an issue. And so he noted, history assures us that Ebola will be fully tamed. However, the next fatal strain is also bubbling up somewhere. And, mentions a number in a bat cave, a poultry farm, whatever. And that's the nature of the war between humans and microbes. There's never a truce, rather. Well, as it turned out, that's exactly what was happening. And Vivek, in one of my interviews, noted that even when the School of Hygiene was being dissolved, and there were more than a few at that time who were thinking we'd solved all the public health issues, another fatal strain was bubbling up somewhere, and that fatal strain was HIV/AIDS. There's another connection to current events. Last week on CBC Radio's The Current, Alan Bernstein, president of CFAR, former director of the Mount Sinai Research Institute, was being queried by Matt Galloway on, you know, the malaise we're in terms of our own COVID issues. And he mentioned that what he felt we should be doing when the crisis is over is that Canada should move immediately to constructing a national vaccine making facility. Well, this is exactly what Connaught was. And it was wholly owned by this very university, by the U of T. And its major reason was, again, Fitzgerald wanting to always drive the price down. He had discovered a diphtheria antitoxin. Canada had been importing foreign antitoxins that were different than his discovery. And, you know, for a price that was 3 to 4 times what he was producing his for. He wanted Canada to have that manufacturing expertise. Connaught was, in its day, one of the largest and most reputable pharmaceutical and vaccine-making companies in the world. Another prime example of Canadian ingenuity, and not just because of its products, but because of its social mission. It forms an important part of the book. Another important point, the pandemic is proving that public health is a strategic asset. It's a form of defense. Today, we defend not only against foreign armies, we defend against foreign viruses, and we need to fund, organize, and staff public health accordingly. The key is preparedness and the ability to rapidly scale up. Another aspect of the book, I get into this only in the briefest way, but maybe we need to start broadening our study of history. Our study of history is primarily in political events. Maybe it now needs to be health. You know, is a reason for a demise of civilization connected to health issues? Does that form part of it? We need to be looking at things like that. There is some precedent for it. The INALE school in France has this 5-volume workout, History of Private Life. Health has got a section in each of the volumes. Maybe it needs to be more prevalent. Social determinants of health are a huge issue in the proper functioning of any society, big part of public health. Another big issue is the welfare state, of which universal health coverage is the very linchpin. And if we take this full circle, what Fitzgerald did in public health and Agnew with hospitals, put Canada squarely at into the cutting edge of social policy. So, should, you know, the question, should this be part? Okay. The other thing I wanted to do, and I've alluded to this, is that the Academy needs to move more into the mainstream, if you will. We need to push our research out. We need to involve ourselves in the world. Trinity does this. Here's an example. The doctor strike in Saskatchewan. A member of the Trinity faculty, GMA Gruba, was involved in writing a number of letters to the press. He was involved in organizing a number of U of T faculty who also wrote such names, very prominent people, Northrop Frye, who at the time was principal of Vic, Bladen, who was the dean of FAS, Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Kelly, the president of St. Michael's, Owen, at the time, the provost of Trin. All of these people were signatories. Gruba's papers were one of my threads that Sylvia talks about. It's how I first met her. I was actually doing a book on Douglas's Department of Public Health, and I kept finding these connections to the School of Hygiene. And I thought, gee, somebody needs to write a book on that. I won't say how that happened, but again, if you're interested afterwards, you can ask me. I want to keep moving through these slides because I need to leave some time for questions. Public engagement is another piece of what the Academy needs to be doing. I'm a little bit biased, perhaps, but I think 2 of the most far-sighted initiatives that have taken place at Trinity in the past number of years are Anne Stacey funding the Health Science and Society stream in Trin 1, and dear to her heart because she was an editor at Maclean's for a number of years, the Comprehensive Paper Program. I mention her in the book. Her initiatives have led to a number of connections to Dalla Lana. Trin students in the Comprehensive Paper course have been linked to other IHP&Me faculty. I've placed a couple with Greg and Sarah over at the NAO. You know, this type of learning taking place in various U of T centers. Anne's endowment has helped Trinity continue to build leaders. We keep pushing our tradition of pushing the edges out, if you will. Our present provost helped establish the Anne Stacy Counseling Initiative. She's had a history of a concern for such initiatives. She's involved in things like the Indigenous initiatives that have been taking place. She was appointed to conduct a review of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. We show her here upon her appointment for the ODA review. So let's start bringing this full circle now. I titled this talk History Writ Large because, as I say, I wanted to proceed from the large and show how it influenced the smaller aspect, the school and the department. But let's now move from that back to the large. What are the larger lessons we can take from this institute? I wanted to show how these two departments might be laying the groundwork for a larger influence in public health and health research. I wanted to show how an emphasis on communication, public engagement, and impact might be a really good combination of how should we be conducting our research. Another area I wanted to highlight is something I call academic entrepreneurism. It began with Fitzgerald and his founding of Connaught Labs. We also see it today with things like the NAO, ACE, C3, people like Dean Brown, Steny Brown on C3, Marshall Doe and Allen on the NAO, and Greg Dobrow in ACE. These people are pushing the envelope and in my opinion, are building nascent policy institutes. And hopefully they're either going to coalesce or something's going to come of that. They're doing excellent work right now. We need the money is really what we need to kind of really take these things somewhere. Okay. The pandemic has brought, again, into clear relief areas, I mean, it's shone a spotlight on almost anything, be it healthcare, be it economics, be it economic inequality, any area that we have failed to make robust enough, it's really glaringly revealed it, not just in Canada. It's also highlighting an existing profound change taking place in the geopolitical landscape, specifically Asia, more specifically, the emergence of Asia. Asia is on track to top 50% of global GDP and drive 40% of the world's consumption. The question is no longer how quickly Asia will rise, it's how it's going to lead. And in this pandemic, lead it did. I've mentioned to you, they have a higher degree of sophistication in public health and healthcare, and a degree of sophistication that is generalized into other areas. Their internet backbone, their digital technologies used in terms of health records. We use faxes. They're moving on many fronts. And so what I want is, again, going back to what I was saying early on, to make this generalizable, but also to understand what Canada is, to understand the potential of this country. Like I say at the bottom of this slide, let's take Canada out for a spin and let's see what it can do. Again, far too much complacency in this country, in my opinion. The pandemic's a perfect example. Our responses, in my opinion, has been very middling. In a Globe, this is not only Les Boehm, there's numerous editorials in, for example, the Globe and the Star, but here's one. Mr. Trump's failure has been American-sized all the way, huge and spectacular. The failures of our governments have been quintessentially Canadian. Many good intentions, but a quiet timidity and severe crippling mediocrity. Now, like I say, those are not my words, but I mean, severe crippling mediocrity might be pushing it a bit, but ooh, not too much. We're not alone in this. Andrew Coyne, a Globe and Mail columnist, a Trin grad, has an opinion piece on this. Everyone has two politics, their own and America's. He notes a sense of decline that's been evident for years to visitors in America. A number of different areas in it. It's crumbling roads, parking its kids in mediocre schools, and to our subject matter, permitting to this day 26 million of its citizens without health insurance. But this struggle that America has, this is us. We're not in the same pickle, but we're distressingly close, in my opinion. But this was not the School of Hygiene. It was not the Department of Hospital Administration. It is not this university or this college. I've mentioned this before, Taiwan and South Korea with rock bottom total COVID cases, rock bottom total deaths. And again, we can never lose sight of this. These are all people. Our governments should be all over this. What's going on in Taiwan and South Korea? We talk of a world away. At Trin, our best students, their whole demeanor is a world away from the norm. What it takes to get there, what it takes to be there, that's a whole other world. So let's be that world. In Canada, let's crank it up a notch or two. Let's play with the all-stars like Taiwan and South Korea. Let's function at that level and let's see what it feels like. Let's be like the best of the best at Trin, the students that we've got at this college, this constant push of theirs, this constant hunger, this idealism to change, to be all that we can be. Let's be that. Finally, I want to say thank you. Thank you to my students. A number of mine, as Sylvia has noted, are here tonight. You may think this a stretch, but my accomplishment is also due to you. You give me joy. You are the future of our country. You will accomplish much for Canada. I just know that you will. I also want to single out Trin faculty no longer with us, to Brian Parker and Pat Brookman, each of whom I spent many hours in conversation with. I stand on the shoulders of giants. So thank you. And I guess I'll turn it over to you, Christopher.
Thank you, Les. That was great. Lots to think about, certainly. And I'll just stop. There we go. So now we're at the Q&A section. So please, if you have any questions, use the Q&A button at the bottom. We have one already. So if you're ready, we'll jump in. Is there a provincial government today that is leading the way in terms of major health system reform and the willingness to draw on the best scholarship and scholars similar to what happened 75 years ago in Tommy Douglas's government?
What a good question. The simple answer is no. There's a book out on Tommy Douglas's government. The Graham Library has it, actually. It's called Dream No Little Dreams. Actually, Greg Marshall, though, was instrumental in trying to convince Al Johnson, who was the youngest deputy provincial treasurer, today it would be called the deputy minister of finance in the country, to publish his, well, edit, if you will, and publish his Harvard dissertation, which incredibly, I just love Linda Corman for this. We've got one of the few printed copies in North America at the Graham Library. It cost quite a bit of money to get it. And Linda did it. Oh, I tell you, I just very much like it. We get people coming to consult that all the time. And so the key about the Tommy Douglas government, Tommy Douglas was his own Minister of Health in his first term. That's how strongly he felt about health. But Tommy Douglas built a government across the board. He innovated in numerous areas. He started something called a budget bureau. He said, what we're really good at in governments is spending money. Well, let's start auditing how we spend. The budget bureau. He said, we're really good at thinking in silos. Every minister, you know, I want highways, I want health, whatever. Let's start thinking broadly. Let's start thinking provincially. He set up something called the Economic Advisory and Planning Board. A fellow that was its secretary for many years, Tommy Shoyama, ended up in Ottawa as the, if I'm remembering right, after he didn't go there for this, but he became the deputy minister of finance. There was something called the Saskatchewan Mafia. When the NDP at the time lost power, people like Pearson, Stanfield, who at the time was Premier of Nova Scotia, and Robichaud in New Brunswick told their people, you get on a plane and you just start hiring people in Saskatchewan sight unseen. I want them. Robichaud, was criticized by his caucus a bit, saying, we don't want these people. We want, Maritimers. Robichaud said, if we're successful, nobody will give a damn where these people came from. So, short answer to your question, is there anybody punching at that level in Canada? No, there's not even remotely close. Douglas was incredible. People after Douglas, I would argue, Woodrow Lloyd, Alan Blakeney, Roy Romano, very much in that ilk. But Saskatchewan hasn't had it since. Romano was the last one. And but I mean, Romano was involved, when Douglas was premier, for example. I mean, I guess these people were paying a lot of attention. So was Blakeney. Blakeney was hired as a Rhodes Scholar. He was a Nova Scotian. And when he was graduating, he said at Oxford, what should I do? People said, you get your bum over to Saskatchewan and talk to Tommy Douglas. So no, we don't have anybody functioning at that level, in my opinion.
Okay, thanks. Les, inspiring to hear the direct recruitment from the best scholars at IHPME to the best leaders under the Douglas government. In the same vein, what can we do at IHPME/DLSPH to funnel our emerging leaders into prominent health systems work?
Another great question. I ask myself this question. The department in the 50s was placing its people in these positions. So was the school. It's not happening now. I mean, Dalla is so young, so I'm not so sure you can do that, point much at Dalla. But and Dalla is doing really, really well. And you're going to hear, I mean, they've got an Institute for Pandemics. They're soon going to launch a fund for health impact. Dalla is moving incredibly fast, but it's got a lot of ground to cover up. But I mean, like I say, they're ranked, in the top 10 easily and always. And they're only, I don't know, they're not even 20 years old. IHPME is older, and IHPME, one of its beauty things is IHPME started out in public health, moved over to the Faculty of Medicine, now is back in public health, and through all of those moves, it's only improved. It's really, really good. My issue with IHPME would be, and I got to be careful on this, I don't know that we're graduating the CEOs of a UHN. Of a Sunnybrook, of a CAMH. Well, I better be careful because CAMH is a graduate. But we're not getting those people like we used to. Vancouver General, Victoria Health System, the Mackenzie Health Sciences Center in Edmonton. I don't know that we're graduating that caliber. And I mean, they might want to slay me over at IHPME, but that's what we should be doing. Now, IHPME has this group, the Masters of Health Informatics, and they're quite the little group, these students. But I don't know over in the health system side that we're doing that. Now, and research, I think we're doing really quite well. But again, this professional program, it's good, make no mistake, and it's the best in Canada. But we're not, and maybe I always expect too much, I don't know, but I don't think we're graduating those people because these are devilish places to run. A TGH, a Sick Kids, a Sinai, man, the pressures at a place. You need a particular type of person. I could go on, I better keep quiet. Allow for more questions.
Okay, next question. How do you balance emphasis on determinants of health against the health needs demands of the very small proportion of the population who accounts for most health spending and the efforts by some providers, particularly of pharmaceuticals, to charge as much as they can for these treatments?
Yeah, a very good question. So there's two aspects, in my opinion, to this question. the issue you are posing of how can we justify bringing healthcare to the marginalized is a huge, huge question. I would argue what we should be aiming at is more universal. No, I better be careful. Two things, two of the principles of the Canada Health Act: more universalism and more comprehensiveness. What do I mean by that? We need to be having universal pharmacare, for example. We need universal mental health. I would argue we need universal seniors care. A former minister in the Quebec government had a bill actually that was passed. He was modeling a universal seniors program based on Japan's. And Pallado called a snap election and lost. And so it never got implemented. We need to be expanding the benefits offered under healthcare. Blakeney drove the prices of drugs down, if I'm remembering my numbers right, by 65% in about 5 years. The way he did this, he developed his own formulary, limited the number of drugs to any one diagnosis, and made pharmaceutical companies compete not every 2 years, not every 1 year, every 6 months. So it can be done. Blakeney had just one heck of a program. And again, for anybody in Saskatchewan, these were available. I would argue things like possession of illicit drugs in small quantities needs to be decriminalized. Bonnie Henry has been all over this in BC. The Canadian Association of Police Chiefs is all over this. Now the City of Vancouver is after the provincial government to pass a law. You know, these people, and they're quite right, are saying this is not a criminal issue. Manufacture and trafficking are. Simple possession of small quantities is a public health issue. This is where we need to start focusing our attention. I'm not sure I'm getting at the nub of your question, though, because maybe you were more, you know, people who can't afford this or people that are marginalized for other reasons. That may have been more your question. So come at me again if you feel I haven't kind of come at it well.
Well, you hear that, folks? Come at him again if you think it's necessary. Until then, I'll move on to the next question. Online health service delivery through startups like Maple and MindBeacon has largely been driven by startups, venture capital funding, and the private sector. How can governments and the public sector innovate when the resources to do so are largely in the private sector, where there isn't a significant institutional pushback?
Yeah, good question. So I believe that there is, you know, I'll just give you my bias straight out, if you know it, but I don't believe, like I say, there is not a role for the private sector in delivery. There is a role for the private sector in tech transfer, commercialization, that type of thing. I've not yet seen the public sector, with the exception of Connaught, but Connaught is very much the exception, that they can match the private sector in that. But in terms of delivery, we're seeing this in our seniors' homes. When you start getting caught between the conflict of service and profit, we know what wins. I don't think there should be that conflict. The issue we face in Canada is because other countries are doing this, how do we, what do I want to say, increase the robustness of our system? Because other countries have done it. Taiwan is spending a little over 6% of its GDP on health. They have a world-class communicable diseases center. They have a world-class pandemic control center. They have a world-class global surveillance unit. You know, that's how they found out about COVID in Wuhan. We had a world-class global surveillance unit called GFIN, and we shut her down May of 2019. Well, wasn't that a smart move? 9 months later, 7 months later. So it can be done. And we can afford it. But the other question I would argue, and you know, if there's any of the very, you know, the economic elite, they're gonna really want to shoot me. But you know, we have since the late 1970s more than halved our tax rates to the rich. We are, depending on the province, at almost a third of our corporate tax rates. A PC Premier, Peter Lougheed, moved corporate tax rates in Alberta, I can't remember if it was 42 or 44%, a PC leader. Rachel Notley is to the left, or to the right rather, of Lougheed. Lougheed was to the left of Rachel Notley. Now, it was a different era, but I mean, this was the 70s. And so Lougheed knew what he wanted to get done, and he knew he needed the money to do it. And somehow, I guess he had the charm that he got all these oil magnates on his side. So it can be done, but it does need money, and it means choices. There are countries in the world that are taxing more than we are, and they are doing better than we are economically. So, you know, all this business that you need low taxes to make your country spin, oh, no, you don't. What you need is a really good, robust middle class. That's what you need. And you also need to mitigate the effects of the poor. Do those two things, you're going to have an economy that's spinning, in my opinion.
Okay. As a follow-up, I think, to the question that you asked for more feedback from, FYI, one reason why IHPME grads aren't moving as quickly into leadership positions is that we used to only admit mid-career professionals, whereas now we also take many research-oriented students who are coming directly from undergraduate programs. So do you have any comment on that?
I'm going to sort of say a yes and a no to that. And the reason I say that is I've been in a number of arguments with the director of the MHSC program, because I've wanted Trinity grads to be hired into that. Like, I was an undergrad was able to apply, and the program was full-time. I have two things that I would want for IHPME. Right now they're on a modular system. So they're basically an executive, health masters. So they're just like Rotman. Rotman brings their students in every 3 days, every 3 weeks. They're there all day. And, you know, at the end of 2 years, they get an MBA. But Rotman has a full-time MBA as well. That's what I want for IHPME. I want a full-time MHSC. And right now, IHPME will not take somebody without 3 years experience. And I want people to be admitted right out of an undergraduate program. And like I say, and again, I've said to them, I've said, you don't know my Trin students. These people, like, you're worried that they're going to get up to speed? Well, give your head a shake and, you know, keep your eyes open, because no sooner will you turn your head and they will be up to speed. You know, these kids are bright. And that's what you need. You need that type of horsepower sort of thing. You know, the synapses firing. And don't get me wrong, IHPME is not admitting idiots, but the type of person that is at a Trin, that is at the top echelon of Vic, for example, admit them straight from undergraduate. There's no problem. You can always get people experience, but what you can't do is whatever they've got in their noggin, that's what they're going to have for the rest of their life. It's not something you can acquire. So I think it should have a full-time program, number one. I think number two, it should be admitting people straight from undergraduate. There's a different level of commitment. The commitment of the IHC people right now, because they all do have a job, is to their job. The commitment of full-time undergraduates is to their program. Just like, for example, they've got a lot of graduate students because they're doing so much research at IPME. That's their commitment. Their commitment is to the program. You need that type of student. It's a whole different lifestyle.
Okay. Is it possible to extend universal health care to all countries worldwide? One thing we must learn from COVID-19 is that we are all in danger, although we have an excellent public health system, if there's a country in which the public health system is poor.
You are so right. The director of the Communicable Diseases Division in the Singapore Department of Health said, nobody is safe until we're all safe. He's quite right. I mean, for example, Korea and Taiwan's borders are still essentially closed. The reason is they've wrestled the virus down, but none of the rest of the world has. So there's that. We're not, you know, none of the one of us is safe until we're all safe. That's the one thing we know about COVID. The other thing that this guy, Vernon Lee is his name, said was that what we want to do is stay ahead of the curve. Our new Bank of Canada governor said much the same thing, but he was talking economics, not healthcare, but you could apply it. That's exactly it. You want to be ahead. You don't want to constantly be reacting, and that's what we're doing right now. You know, this Matt Galloway program I tell you about, he was getting under fire a little bit because he was being critical. Well, this is my history. In a hospital, you damn right you're critical. You're always critical of what you're doing. Why? Because lives are on the line. And if you're making mistakes now, you damn well better know you're making mistakes, because the next patient's going to come through the door in a matter of hours. So we need to be looking at what we're doing now. And we need to do it not with the, you know, sense of beating ourselves up, but what are we doing wrong? What do we need to change? Because like I say, Canada, it's middling. We're not the worst, but we're a long way from the best. So, you know, why? And we can't do everything Korea and Taiwan are doing. They've got years ahead of us. This ain't instant coffee. You don't put these institutions into place in a moment. You know, they've been doing this since SARS, since 2003. So, okay, we can't do that, but what can we do? What lessons can we take for the here and now? Now, I think repeat me that question again. I think I missed part of it.
Sure. Let me just find it again. Is it possible to extend universal health care to all countries worldwide?
Right. That's it. That's what I need. The answer is yes, and it's being done. It's being done in Africa. The most telling example is Rwanda. Rwanda was the poorest country in Africa, had fought that genocidal civil war. I mean, holy gosh, that country was decimated. The president decided he was going to implement universal health care. He wasn't going to do it across the board. There's no way he could even begin. He was who was in my mind when I said women and babies. That's what he did. I can't remember the statistics, but in 5 short years, the death rate of mothers and infants was way down. Don't hold me to this, but I think it was about 25%. And you know, without mothers and babies, you're in a little bit of a pickle. I mean, you need tomorrow. You need tomorrow's generation. So smart move. So yes, and actually Rwanda captured the world's attention. When was it? Last September, not 2020, but 2019. Everybody came to the, not everybody, but anybody that wanted to, came, the delegates, the ambassadors and the heads of state came to the UN one day early. And if they came one day early, they could go to 2 different presentations, one on UHC, one on climate change. Well, you know what the press, you know, was all over climate change, and UHC didn't get much of a, much press coverage. But if I'm remembering my dates right, in 2012, the United Nations passed a UHC resolution that every country in the world should work toward that. And they meant the poor countries as well. In 2019, that's precisely why they were there that one day early, is to say to these countries, it is possible. Rwanda, there are some others, have shown us that it is.
Okay, great. We are coming up on time. However, there are 3 questions left in the chat. So if you'll indulge us, I'll see if I can get through all 3, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay. The first comes from your fellow Trinity fellow, Joy Fitzgibbon. Les, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I am so with you on your interpretations with regard to our response on COVID, the need for a comparative international perspective, and the need to grow visionary organizations within U of T with the courage to aim high and speak truth to power based on vigorous scholarly debate and research. Let's say we continue to grow this institutional capacity. What are the barriers to our impact at the policy level, provincially and federally, and how may we overcome them?
Oh my gosh. Joy's really giving me a challenge here. Well, just before I answer, please say hello to your dad, who is another person that I used to get into long conversations with in the SCR. I kind of think we're starting. So, you know, I've got this slide for my students in Wednesday's class. you know, the first, some of you will have read this. The first thing the provincial government did when, you know, COVID was rearing its head was go to McKinsey and give them a consulting contract. And I, with my students, what I'm going to do this Wednesday and say, you know, you're hooped when, you know, a foreign army has crossed your border and the first thing you do is hire a consultant. And meanwhile, the army's kind of advancing on your capital. And so it's exactly what happened. I mean, the foreign army is a virus and it's advancing, God knows, any place that, you know, some of these people have landed in. And so, you know, you knew we were going to be in trouble. You know, not only did they not know what to do, they didn't know where to begin. Anyway, so one of the things they've done, but they've not, in my opinion, done it. Like, so for example, Steny Brown there from Dalla, Lana, the dean, he's chairing, he's the co-chair of what I think they call the Science Advisory Table. But the problem is the table's too big. And the other problem is you can't fight a pandemic through a committee. You can fight it with a couple of good, you know, generals, if you will, but the committee is advisory. You need somebody out there in front that you are going to delegate authority. So for example, in Taiwan, the head of the, I can't remember what they call it, National Epidemic Command Center or something like that, which by legislation they would activate, and they did. He becomes the person, like he's got a heck of a lot of power. It rivals that of the president. And he's calling the shots. So all you need to do is make sure you got a really good head there. Now, what Joy is getting at is bigger, if you will, and that's where, you know, what she said. It's bigger than COVID. You know, we need public health. We need to recognize the import of public health. We need to recognize the import of broader health insurance. We are amongst the lowest benefits in the world of a country with health insurance. And we can't afford it. We can't, well, other countries have. Hello. I guess if it were me, I would go to somebody like a Vivek Goel and say, Vivek, I'm really pleased that you've been hired to be the president of Waterloo. And if I were the prime minister, but I want you to come to Ottawa. I want you to build me a public health system that is second to none. Now, you know, Vivek would be pushing back at me because he'd say, Les, how can I do that? Health is a provincial responsibility, and he's right. But health has wide powers in an epidemic. We've chosen not to exercise them, but those powers are there. Now, for healthcare delivery, yes, they're with the provinces. For public health in normal times, yes, they are with the provinces. But a question Canada has to ask itself is our decentralized federation a hindrance in something like a global pandemic? We really have to ask ourselves that question, because I don't know that we don't need more power at the center. I don't know. But then how do we get it? If I want a Vivek Goel, for example, or a Steny Brown, I could name you a few people. I don't, you know, how do we get them the power that they need? Because Ontario can be a nice playpen. There's no doubt about it. But we need more than Ontario. So I don't know. Joy, I think what I have to say to you is I'm not sure I've got an answer that is the same quality as the question was.
Very diplomatic of you. Okay, our second to last question. Les, beyond the role of an academic center in creating national leading institutions, what is the role of the federal government thinking back to what Tommy Douglas did for this country?
Very good question. So Tommy Douglas started to build institutions, and they were almost institutions that were going to challenge, I'm going to say him, really, his government. And that's kind of what you need. You know, you need a certain creative tension. So another Trinity grad, Mike Bronskill. I felt Mike Bronskill did this. He ran a world-class imaging group. But I often felt that he allowed for a certain creative tension within that group. And those people were and are bright. And that's what you need. You need a leader who is going to allow for that type of thing. And so that's a balance that you've got to strike. What Tommy Douglas didn't do this part, it was Woodrow Lloyd, his successor, but Woodrow Lloyd started something called, I can't remember the name. Saskatchewan Public Administration Foundation. I can't remember. Marshall would know this in a moment. And he instituted it, but the premier that they lost the next election to, Ross Thatcher, dissolved it, and they hired a Liberal to run it. So it wasn't an NDP person running it. And that was its precise thing, was to kind of keep them on their toes. And Tommy Douglas did this with other institutions. And that's what you got to be doing, this institution building. I would argue we need a health policy institute. I would argue we need a foreign relations policy institute. We need to be building these capacities. We had a world-class, anybody at the WHO will tell you, GFEN was world-class, and we shut it down. I mean, who does these things? Not only can we not build institutions when we've got them, we haven't even got the moxie to know we do, I guess. Otherwise, why did we shut it down? So it's this institution building, and it's going to take years. And it's you know, they're drawing upon Dalla, Lana, not just Steny Brown, but other people. I sometimes wonder if one of the reasons Vivek Goel resigned from being VP of research and innovation at the U of T is that he wanted to put his mind more to this, and he couldn't if he was in a major admin position at the U of T. So it's starting to happen, but it's got to happen on a much larger scale. And I would argue we've got to start talking to these people like Dean Brown and Vivek, and I could name you others. Walter Woodges is a great health economist, Audrey Laporte, another. You know, we've got to start talking to these people. A lot of the ability is there. We're just not using it. You know, health informatics, Julie Zarb, you know, there's a lot of these, you know, jewels over there. We got to start using them. We got to figure out how to do it, I guess. But, you know, that's what we need to do.
Okay, last question, with an eye to the moving forward, I guess. Prior to COVID, Ontario was going through a health leadership crunch through mass health systems restructuring. What is your advice to emerging leaders looking to ride the newfound platform of COVID to continue making a difference post-pandemic?
Well, I guess my first thing is we need you. You know, when you get out there on the frontiers, you will have many people just really anxious to dig the ground out in front of you. You know, it's a very competitive world out there. And, you know, there's many times you're going to be swatted down, but you got to get up. The key is not how many times you get swatted down. The key is how many times you get up. And so we need you out there. We have the potential in Canada. I mean, Australia is doing much better than we are in COVID, for example. You know, that's another one we could, they're not as, you know, their metrics don't, you know, they're different than Taiwan and Korea, but they're pretty damn good in Australia. And of course they had, you know, Melbourne, there's a few places that were ouch. But overall, again, you can't argue with the national numbers. They were all over this. We just need the will, but we need the will not only in health. This has to be generalizable through the whole country. We've got to aspire to this. And Canadians don't, is my opinion. I wish, you know, this is where I wish I was in a live audience, because maybe I'm being too critical of Canadians. I don't know, but I want more from them. That's what I want. So you young people, we need you. We need you. You know, the problem with the best of the best is many times they go to where the action is. Maybe that's why we don't have we did it one time. We had excellent public health people across this nation. I mean, not in every single province, but oh, I bet you in 60%. We had it. So we can get it again. World War II, what we accomplished on multiple fronts was incredible. So, you know, it can be done, but it's got to last. It can't be, you know, oh yeah, we did it for 3 years now. I think I'll go pop a beer and watch the NFL or whatever. You know, we got to keep at it. You know, something like Taiwan, I bet you they're focused because somebody'd like to wipe them off the map. And, you know, you can't afford to make too damn many mistakes. You better be, you know, batting at world-class level right across the board. You know, that's a real good focus, is when you think, ooh, you know, a former vice dean used to say, you know, if you're gonna be hung tomorrow, it really helps focus the mind. Well, maybe that's what Taiwan does. I don't know. But I mean, again, their leader, I mean, you know, the president, PhD out of London School of Economics, their VP, PhD in epidemiology and human genetics out of Hopkins. You know, Merkel, PhD in quantum chemistry. And people will say, what has that got to do with? Well, what it's got to do with is that these people understand the complexity of information and the complexity of modern decision making.
Great. Thank you so much. We have definitely gone over time, but I would once again like to thank you, Les, for an enthusiastic, impassioned, edifying, and certainly entertaining lecture, and for being so generous with your time and answering all of our audience questions. Normally, we would have a table set up at the back of the combination room where we'd be selling copies of the speaker's book, which I just happen to have here. So we can't do that this evening, obviously, but the book's publisher, McGill Queen's University Press, has very generously agreed to offer attendees of this lecture a 20% discount on all copies purchased through them. They're a little bit big to fit into a stocking, but undoubtedly will make great gifts for all of those hard to buy for people in your life. So you should have received the link to the McGill Queen's University Press website, along with the discount code in the final reminder email that you would have received right before the lecture started. But I am also now sending it into the chat. So if you can look at it there. So I would encourage you to pick up a copy of the book. It's a great read. Thank you to our audience for coming out tonight, and thank you again, Les. That was fantastic.
Well, I have to say thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. All
right. With that, I'm going to stop the recording and end the lecture. Oh, Sylvia, do you have something to say?
Saying good night. Just saying good night.
Okay.
Thank you for coming.
Wonderful. All right. Have a good night, everybody.